I think I've covered what I wanted to say about Winnicott. And just again to summarize, Winnicott's strength, I think, is that unlike Kohut, who we're going to turn to, and some relational analysts, he held on to both sides of, the aggression, the unconscious. Okay, when I say both sides, what do I mean? Look, we started with the pendulum, and Freud initially thinking that pathology is all caused by trauma in the real world. And then we saw that the pendulum swung all the way to the internal world. And psychoanalysis was preoccupied not with trauma, but with the child's desires and fantasies. Somehow Winnicott transcends this either-or. He certainly sees the role of environmental failure, parental failure, failures of ego-relatedness, failures of containment, failures of the holding environment, maternal failure. I mean, he's aware of all of this as derailing the child's going-on being, so that the child has to start reacting in the face of impingement and abandonment, and therefore the child has to develop a false self. So there's Winnicott, like the Kohutians and the relationalists, seeing the origin, like Ferenczi, seeing pathology as grounded in painful early experiences. But on the other hand, there's another side of certainly both Klein and Winnicott, which quite apart from, which sees not all conflict arising from disappointment and environmental failure. They see something tragic intrinsic to the human condition as such. Now, Freud tried to theorize this tragic element using the concept of the biological drives. But it doesn't need to be conceived in that biologistic way. Melanie Klein sees something tragic in the human condition that all of us are going to hate. Not because there's an aggressive drive. She doesn't ground it in biology, really. She says that all of us are going to hate, and it's not because of parental failure or environmental failure necessarily, without denying the role of that. That's going to make it much worse. But even if there's no environmental failure, we're going to hate, because we're all going to face frustration. The human condition is intrinsically frustrating. And we're going to hate. And now, because we're hating, we're going to feel guilty. We're going to be inwardly punishing ourselves, beating up ourselves. We're going to channel the hate that we're feeling in relation to frustration. We're going to channel a lot of it back against ourselves in the form of a persecutory superego. And there's a sense in which this is nobody's fault. You know, there's a sense then in which Winnicott is, and Klein and Freud, they're theorizing it in different ways, but they're saying that there is mental suffering that's a part of the human condition that is nobody's fault. We should be able to alleviate it. I mean, to the extent that we can provide better caretaking to infants, to the extent that we can become better caretakers, we can better minimize the frustration, but we certainly can't eliminate it. And then this is not to even begin to take into account things like poverty and class and all of the other kinds of widespread social factors that cause major frustration in childhood and infancy. Okay, so let's some of the self and relational analysts, they get rid of the tragic. They get rid of the existential. You know, like Freud and Klein and Winnicott understand something. There's an existential dimension to their thought. Not all human suffering can be laid at the door of failures of parenting. You know, there's something in human existence as such. You know, Fairbairn, for example, Fairbairn, we haven't talked much about Fairbairn, but Fairbairn tries to sound realistic. He argues that all of us will inevitably fall into what he calls split ego conditions. That is, all of us will have fragmented selves to some degree. Because, why? Because all of us have experienced parental failure of some kind. Now, he tries to sound existential because he says such parental failure is inevitable. And therefore, we'll all have this fragmentation that comes from parental failure. But he's not really being existential. He's simply saying parental failure is inevitable, but he's still blaming it on parental failure. What he's not saying is that even if there was no parental failure, there'd still be fragmentation. That is not what he's saying. Even if there was no parental failure, and of course there can't be, there has to be parental failure, but even if there weren't, or let me put it in self-psychology terms, the Gohutians will never say that even if the parental self-objects were perfect, the baby will still fragment. They will not say that. Okay? And that's their romanticism. And that's their avoidance of the tragic and of the existential. That's their avoidance of that. So I think that I think Fairbairn's a romantic. I think the followers of Kohut are romantic. I think some of it's hard to generalize about people who call themselves relational analysts, because there's a lot of differences among people who call themselves relational analysts. But there's a lot of romantics among the relational analysts, I think. And they don't like Klein, and they don't like Freud, and they don't like those who point to the existential elements of human suffering, you know. A bit utopian, I think, and therefore a bit blaming. Because you see, if you think that all unhappiness is somebody's fault, you tend to be blaming. You have someone who is close to them who has died, and they're mourning. I don't think we imply that their pain is neurotic. That's existential. It's a loss, and we respect it as such. So certainly the whole theme of death, the whole theme of loss, it's not just the loss of people, it's the loss of various hopes. A person has always hoped, say, for a certain career or something, and then, or they've hoped for children and the children haven't come. And so something is lost, and we just respect the mourning as loss is a part of life, you know. I mean, again, I've learned so much from my old mentor, Eli Sagan. A few years before he died, he said, Don, do you want to know the secret of aging? And I said, yeah. And he said, it's loss. It's loss, and it's more loss.
Like accepting it?
Well, he says it's just a whole bunch of losses, and therefore it's a question of like saying goodbye over and over and over again. Goodbye to this, goodbye to that, goodbye to this, goodbye to that. Actually, he was simply saying something that Gabriel Marcel and others, most recently in his little book on evil by Terry Eagleton, who I think is just a brilliant Marxist, Catholic, existentialist, psychoanalytic thinker. No, he's brilliant. But in his little book on evil, you know, he follows Gabriel Marcel, saying that a properly lived human life should be an exercise in learning self-depossession. That is, that maturing should be a process of learning how to let go. And only people who during life have learned how to dispossess themselves of their selves can have a proper death. Because death is the ultimate act of self-dispossession and the ultimate act of letting go. And so life should be a training in letting go. I think that's quite brilliant, actually, and a number of thinkers have said that. Okay, let's other ways in which we deal with the existential. We don't. I mentioned losses. Okay, but here's another way. Conflict. Conflict is a part of the human condition. I mean, Freud knew that. Certainly, Klein knew that. In no way does the psychoanalytic tradition ever suggest that it's only neurotics who have conflicts. Everybody has conflicts. They're existential. You can't, therefore, when patients are suffering from conflict, and conflict can take many forms. I mean, Freud introduced us to conflict between superego and ego and id, and then between eros and thanatos. I wanted to add conscience as a fourth structure of the mind because I want to talk about conflict between conscience and the superego. I might have a racist superego that says turn Jim in, and I might have a conscience that says, no, Jim is my loving and loved friend. I'm not going to turn him in. So there's a conflict. I mean, but life is full of these conflicts. We have conflicting attachments. We're attached to this person, and we're attached to this person, and there's a conflict, and I may have to let one or the other of these people go. Kierkegaard drew attention to a type of existential conflict that we have, because he distinguished neurotic guilt from existential guilt. And he distinguished neurotic anxiety from existential anxiety. So here's an example of existential guilt. Kierkegaard says, if I fail to develop my own potentials, think of the Bible story of being given the talents, and the poor servant doesn't do anything but bury them, and then when the master comes, he gives them. He hasn't done anything with them. If you fail to develop your own potentials and talents, you're failing yourself. And therefore there is existential guilt. You feel guilty for failing yourself. But if you do develop your talents and your potentials, you may have to leave somebody who doesn't develop. And now that you've developed, you're out of sync with them. And perhaps you have, you may feel, therefore, that you now have to be, in a sense, disloyal. Or you have to break what's the word I'm looking for? It's a biblical term. God with man formed a covenant. Mm-hmm. Exactly the word. Yes, you may have to break a covenant because you've grown and the other person hasn't grown, or they've grown in a different direction and you haven't. And so now you've got guilt. Guilt if I do grow, guilt if I don't grow. Therefore, guilt is unavoidable, part of the human condition. That's existential. We can't go assuming that all guilt is neurotic, and therefore that it's all going to be resolvable by therapy. Sometimes as therapists, what we do is we don't help people eliminate guilt, we help them bear it, because it has to be carried. And we help them learn how to carry it instead of eliminate it. So those are existential dimensions, I think.